So thank you, Sebastian and Goose, the team there at Goose, for inviting us and hosting Sarah, Christine, Dave, and I, and inviting us to join this vibrant community around wargaming. It's pretty exciting for us. So please don't blame Sebastian or Goose for if this little virtual workshop fails utterly, which I doubt. But if it does, please blame me, and it's no responsibility on Sebastian and the team there. I'd also like to thank Sarah for pushing us on the edge of the scholastic envelope and embracing what Ellie Bartels spoke to y'all, this group last week, on the social science of wargaming and how we're bringing wargaming into as an academic discipline, bringing wargaming into the social sciences, bringing wargaming closer, enhancing the rigor of wargaming. So again, with my teammates, Sarah, Christine, Dave, and there's others on our team, but we're all excited to be here. To join the community, like those like Ella and Una Wong, who's spoken here at past Goose events. So what I'd like to do is reflect a little, if we can, if my slides advance, there we go. Last year, Dr. Una Wong spoke at a past Goose event about wargaming and design thinking. And she introduced to the community a 5-step process for designing wargaming, from empathizing, defining, ideation, prototyping, and testing. And it's iterative, obviously, that you go back and forth as you refine it. So what we'd like to do tonight is to focus on the center, focus on the ideation, and that's where our breakout workshop is going to be. We'll share with you 3 possible ways we could ideate virtually, but to do that, we have to sort of catch up to that step of the process and begin with empathize and then go into define to get there. So to get to ideation, we're going to have to step through a little bit. And what I'd like to do in the emphasize then is to describe what sort of research we're doing, how it's nested into a broader research project, and then how we think wargaming, serious gaming in particular, is going to help us advance our research. So I am going to fiddle with my screen here. I apologize. I'd like to show you a brief video. Let's see. About the research. And Sarah, could you give me a thumbs up? You see it?
John, we can't hear it really.
We're studying shipping for indigenous populations, food security, conflict.
By working together, we're starting to think differently about our own discipline.
I'm Professor Sarah Cobb, and I study conflict analysis and resolution.
I'm Professor Self Prayer, and I study flood hazards.
I am Professor Elise Miller-Hooks, and I use math to solve real-world problems. Together, we can address something much larger. This is about the future of this planet.
Hey, John, you may have to authorize your computer to mic it into Zoom. So you go to the Zoom feature, and then you give it, you had to authorize it to do the display, to do whatever audio you're using.
Okay, well, see, I did blame myself for utterly failing in that regard. So
it's okay. So what about you just toss in the YouTube link into the chat, and we can have people sort of just look at it on their own. I can just sort of pause the recording.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is a project, a National Science Foundation funded project that's a collaboration between myself from the Carter School and the College of Engineering at George Mason. We have civil engineers, we have ice specialists, we have wave hydrologists, and the PI on the project, Elise Miller-Hooks, is as an engineer, specializes in shipping. So what we're trying to do is to look at the, let's say, to posit a set that, to look at the set of changes that are happening in the Arctic, right? And the Arctic is supposed to be ice-free by 2035. They are experiencing double the rate of climate change of any other place on the planet. It's now about 5 degrees warmer. It's changing all the subsistence livelihoods of all the indigenous people that line the coasts. We're going to have people are going to, all the shipping is going to be going over the globe instead of around the globe. It's going to change the trade dynamics around the world. And it's certainly going to raise the issues of, let's say, conflict, not only in local communities, but in between nations and regions. And to top it all off, the Arctic Council, which is the governing body for, ensuring collaboration across the 8 nations, the 25 observer nations, and the 6 permanent members, which are the indigenous communities, has a footnote in it that very clearly says it's not going to have anything to do with security. So there's no global body, let's say, other than UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea, which is going to help the Arctic try to work through some of the increasing competition and the downstream effects of these changes that are going to take place all over the Arctic. So that's a little bit of the background. It's an interdisciplinary team, and my particular job, let me just speak to that for a second, John. Our job, our team here, what we're trying to do is surface or we're trying to look at narratives in the Arctic, both in policy documents and in interviews with people from all over, to determine or discern the conflict indicators that are present in those narratives, so that we could build an early warning system from the bottom up, basically based on the stories that are in the policy documents and the stories that people are telling. And the reason for that is that we would like to help the Arctic become reflective about the way in which it's understanding conflict, and to look at the implications for how they want to manage competition and crises as they emerge. Is anybody else? John, did you?
No, that sums it up. And I would just only reflect, Sarah, that your own team is made up of PhDs in communication, cultural studies,
Right.
Political science, conflict analysis and resolution, and undergraduates in forensic science. So we're all coming together to solve this, to solve these challenges, to moving forward in a very edgy sort of way, in a pushing the envelope,
Yeah.
sort of way.
Thank you.
Yep. So Sarah suggested that our research question, and before that video starts, our research question that we set out to answer was to help build a narrative-based conflict early warning system. We needed to understand what narrative propositions do Arctic stakeholders rely on, such as perceptions of risk, and how do those propositions inform their preferences and their choices. So to form a baseline on which to gauge conflict escalation, we've surveyed the strategies of the policies and strategies of the Arctic Council, as Sarah said. The Arctic Council is comprised of the 8-member Arctic states, those states with Arctic territories, the 6 communities of indigenous peoples as participants, and the non-observer 13 observer states. And the council is the highest level of intergovernmental forum that addresses issues faced by the Arctic states and its indigenous people. And it was a great place for us to start to get a baseline of this narrative landscape, because all but maybe one or two of its participants all have published policy documents or strategy documents about their engagement in the Arctic. In fact, of I think the one observer state that doesn't, Poland, doesn't have a strategy, but they're writing one now. And then we're still trying to get a hold of an indigenous, but 34 documents that we have provided us a very rich baseline for us to begin understanding the perceptions in the Arctic. So as I mentioned, to study this baseline of risk, we've coded excerpts from about 34 different policy documents, and we continue to collect more, but we are using a theory-driven approach, using the decision-making logic of strategic choice. And strategic choice as a theory drives our research as the dynamic calculations of changing circumstances, modifying preferences, and adapting expectations under conditions of uncertainty and complexity. So this sounds very perfect as a model for the rapidly changing and vastly complex relationships at play in the Arctic. And I might add, as a decision-making logic, it sort of nests well with wargaming and serious gaming as an idea, the decision-making. So at least we assume this will help us move forward into the serious gaming.
John, can I make just one quick point?
Yes, ma'am.
And that is these three components. So you're going to talk about motives and perceptions, etc. But just don't forget, we want to emphasize that these are embedded inside of narrative architecture more broadly. So these are narrative propositions that occur inside of narratives, which have beginning, middles, and ends, right? Past and present and future. So you have to see that these are not isolated entities, but drawn from the broader narrative frameworks. Just wanted to emphasize that.
No, absolutely. And so that I don't lose the point, what's interesting about them is they seem to all reflect on each other. We will see, because of this dynamic nature, the continual change, but they will add new episodes, they'll add new characters as new strategies are published, and we have seen them talking about each other's, not just their actions, but also their strategies and their policies and what they mean to the choices that they perceive are presented to them. And as Sarah said, the logic of strategic choice includes these three propositions. That is, that they are statements or assertions, expression, a judgment, or opinion, which fits very well into the narrative construct. And that is motive, perception, and preference, where motive represents propositions of intent. Perception represents the assessment of conditions and expectations, and the preferences are evaluative judgments of courses of actions to achieve different outcomes, alternative outcomes. And using then this logic of decision making, we coded all those available strategy and policy documents for the presence of these propositions. So if I could give you a quick sampling of what we uncovered in these strategy documents, and then we'll show you how we've put it to play in risk. But from a motive perspective, you can see that motives tend to align with state level interest, as the preponderance of the documents are obviously written by state actors, with security and economics dominating the propositions of motive that culminate in a theme of sustainable development. Propositions of perception reflect a tension of those interests, of whose interests are at stake, i.e., Arctic territorial members, establishing their or positioning their jurisdiction, if you will, for making choices in the Arctic, and those non-Arctic state actors positioning themselves as legitimate speakers and actors in the Arctic as well. And then on the perceptions, what we tend to see is also the tension, if you will, maybe anxiety about climate change tends to dominate the perceptions in the Arctic. And then finally, propositions of cooperation are the leading preference for action, which from a Arctic Council state, that's one of the leading preferences for strategic choices, that international cooperation is the mode to which we resolve concerns about the Arctic. Now, to visualize this slightly differently and help us begin to think about the conflict early warning, we apply a simple risk model to consider the perceived probability and consequence of these propositions by our different member type. So where the measure of probability of a risk is the frequency of a proposition occurring as a ratio of the total propositions in the data set. For example, the probability that a risk proposition is mentioned in any document is divided by the total number of risks in all the policy documents. And the measure of consequence is the qualitative evaluation of the extent of damage to interests that is derived specifically from the narrative propositions from using limited, major, catastrophic, and existential. So for example, a Swedish risk proposition of the ecological disruption can have devastating consequences for seafarers, marine flora and fauna, and those who depend on sea for their livelihood, lends itself for qualitative evaluation of existential consequence to an ecological risk. And what we did then was, with these probabilities by member type and with these consequences by member type, we then mapped using a simple risk model here that you can see, where we can do some crosswise comparisons of members, indigenous and observers, and we can see little movement here and some concern but overall what we find interesting is that there's a moderate risk profile here, where there's a somewhat unlikely probability but yet major consequences of any actions. And here, through what's consistent is that ecological and environmental risks seem to weigh heavy on all participants, no matter what type, followed by conflict and security, and then at the very end, economic and health and disaster concerns. So from this baseline of risk, we will continue to collect new documents that represent new episodes in the narratives of the Arctic, and then we'll be able to sense any changes in the perceptions of risk as potential leading indicators of conflict there. So as we move forward, therefore, in our research, we considered the work of the larger new Arctic team that Sarah described, we begin to ask ourselves, what alternative futures in the Arctic result in strategic choices of conflict or cooperation? For example, as the teams are modeling the retreating sea ice, at what point does increased activity in the open seas escalate conflict? At what point does new shipping lanes and new shipping routes and new volume of shipping or presence increase tensions, escalate conflict, or drive towards cooperation on a number of different threat matters? And so asking this question, I think Perla and McGrady offer us a very nice nice segue into the gaming world and why wargaming works. This provides us a nice theoretical perch. Specifically, what they describe in why gaming works is that wargaming operates as a participatory narrative experience. So in that, presented narratives are scenarios within which games are played, and the constructed narratives are how participants legitimize or rationalize their choices when they're presented with the scenarios. And this allows us then to refine our research question a little more in the exploration of a serious game to be what scenarios, i.e. the presented narratives, result in strategic choices, i.e. the constructed narratives of conflict or cooperation. This allows us for this ideation, for this little workshop session to then transition into the define phase where I'd like to take a step further and say, well, how can we explore, how could we explore presented and constructed narratives in a serious game? So to do so, to help us transition into this define phase, I'd like to quickly step through 2 studies on narrative analysis of wargaming, and then 1 example of a narrative-centric wargame that we've participated in. So first, again, building on Perlin McGrady's propositions that wargames are participatory narrative experiences, Sarah and Yuna Wong collaborated on a research into the utility of narrative analysis of wargames in order to increase the rigor of wargame analysis. And then building on that research, Lauren Kenny and I, students also at George Mason at the time, led a larger research effort using the same research goals, but with a slightly different design to answer the same question about the utility of narrative analysis in wargamings. And this research then holds that the way in which constructive narratives emerge may reveal patterned interactions potentially understood as a function of narrative logic. Therefore, narrative analysis of wargames seeks to understand the patterns of meaning making supporting the choices in this game, in these games. So for Sarah and Yuna, they sought to advance the qualitative rigor of wargame analysis through the introduction of narrative methodologies, and subsequently their study pairs structural narrative analysis in the form of actant analysis with a seminar style wargame. In that design and play, this wargame lent itself to narrative approaches that were employing narrative as a method and are actually an elicitive technique that generates narrative. And what I mean to say that actant analysis offers us a structured framework for examining narrative messaging and perceptions within the context of a game. And Sarah and Yuna reveal that through this methodology, that changes in the narrative structure act as leading indicators of critical movements within gameplay. These critical movements define episodes where the perspectives of legitimacy of the other changes, as observed in changes in character roles, and the shifting relationships between players result in either escalation or de-escalation of the conflict. Notably, accessibility of narrative approaches. Sarah and Yuna concluded that its application to a broader community was necessarily tied to a greater understanding, obviously, of narrative analysis approaches. So let me introduce of what we mean then, and what we mean by structural narrative analysis, and give you an example of what the actant analysis looks like. in the course of a game. So specifically, structural narrative analysis, for which actant analysis is, are pertinent to wargame analysis in that within the participatory narrative experience, action is restricted to a narrative logic that emerges and shapes the scenario as it unfolds. This is a finding from Sarah and some fellow authors previously. In what they were trying to understand was that narrative logic, then this type of narrative logic reflects the parties' commitments, their roles, their moral frameworks, and all of these factors then inform the choices that they make within the game. And so here, what we see is a model of actant analysis. This was a tool that we used to collect data during our wargame analysis, between Lauren, Kenny, and I's wargame analysis. But this is the same model that Sarah and Una used, that was advanced by AJ Gremius, where actant analysis is built on the idea from Vladimir Pop's morphology of the folktale, where there are 6 core structural components of a narrative, and you see that at the bottom, where there is a sender, a receiver, subject, an object, helper, and opponent. And in this structure, the sender instigates action for the subject to attain an object, wherein a receiver will benefit from the action, and a helper aids the action, and an opponent obviously hinders it. And so what we postulated that actant analysis then easily lends itself to an interactive logic of military strategy, if merely just in a narrative form. For example, a president and military commanders fit neatly within the actant of sender, and subject roles with object the ends that they seek to attain. The receiver represents the national interest, that the nation will prosper from achieving these objectives, and opponents represents threats to those interests, and helpers are the means available, the terrain, the context in which everything is happening. And this leads us to the way of the strategic formula of ends, ways, means, and then leaves it to the strategist's own genius, the military commander's own genius, to construct a compelling narrative to get to the object. Lauren and I would use the same model of data collection in where Sarah and Una used a seminar style war game. We used a much larger game that was pitted against 6 teams competing in 3 different games, but they were all using the same game. It was Dunnigan's Drive on Mets. So we had 3 games running at the same time, 2 sides per, where we had 1 analyst in each team collecting data on the turns. And there were 7 game turns, but also this was embedded in a larger Moores Society conference, where they were hosting a game night, if you will. But the game night actually was an opportunity for different analysts to try to explore different analytical methods in wargaming. So there were, there were campaign analysis, human performance analysis, course of action analysis, rapid assessment process, and our team all observing these particular games ongoing on that same evening. So the Jim Dunnigan's game allowed us to help simplify and help simplify the game design so that both our actant analyst could also understand what was going on within the game. And then the structure of the game, having trained graduate students being the data collectors in the game, allowed us to present multiple places where we were collecting data. So we were just expanded our team, expanded the data collection in a little bit more simpler game. So what were some of our findings? So for brevity's sake, I'm going to exclude the second line of finding, which is a functional narrative analysis that we uncovered, and I'll just stick with the structural analysis. And the first structural finding that we observed in our games was that the variation of object in a game led to various strategic implications, and perhaps reflects the player's understanding or misunderstanding and application of strategy within these games. So specifically, as theorist Admiral Wiley notes, the successful strategist is one who controls the pattern of war to his own ends. Controlling the pattern of war begins with understanding the objective of the strategist and his adversary from which his actions and choices are made. So the implication then is that simply poor strategic choices follow from misunderstanding of the object. And the process tracing of object articulated by a team over the course of the 7 turns of each of these games allows our analysts then to pinpoint the specific instances when the strategic reasoning became problematic for each of these teams. Thus then providing feedback that can be used to avoid repeating this mistake in future games. The second important structural finding involved the observed variance between helpers and opponents throughout the course of the game. And the most obvious opponent researchers reported for teams was the rival team. However, regularly restricted terrain or bad intelligence reporting became a tension where it vacillated between helper and opponent. So rather than being fixed on the adversary as the opponent, oftentimes what we're saying is what we saw was the team began to fight the terrain, or the team began to fight the rules or the intelligence that was presented to them. And so that's what we mean by the vacillation between helper and opponent. And therefore, when we were identifying the various helpers and opponents that emerge across the different terms, that helped us to serve as one way of revealing some of the structural constraints that impacts players' strategies, and more specifically, how the presence of these specific actants impacts the conflict dynamics of the game. So again, overall, what we're saying is these actions, very simply, that these actions were the choices of the participants were constrained by the narrative structures that they were employing. So these findings also reveal the extent to which players' actions are shaped by the structural constraint, both in presented and constructed narratives. While players must operate within the confines of a presented narrative, to what extent do the teams have the capacity to introduce shifts into the constructive narrative, and to what extent can these findings be used to improve strategy and influence risk calculations is our concern. And so here, the use of actant analysis as a process tracing allows analysts then to identify distinct patterns of actions during the gameplay, and then observe the extent to which certain strategic risks were successful or detrimental for teams over the course of the game. These studies also reveal that if gaming is a participatory narrative experience, analysis of gameplay and the embedded narrative transformation requires frameworks then for capturing the presented and constructed narratives, and then the transformation that occurs between them. So as was displayed in the second study, where there were 3 yet separate simultaneous war games revealing very similar patterns emerging within the constructed narratives, we see that subsequently those changes impacted their strategic choices throughout the game. And specifically, actant analysis reveals that the narrative structure players impose on their choices, and the positioning that occurs in the interaction of their choices creates either coherence or incoherence in their logic of their gameplay. Before we step off into the ideation phase, I promised an example of a narrative-centric wargame. And here, this is a screen capture of a strategy bridge article that my co-author, Lieutenant Colonel David, and I wrote to reflect on a war game that we designed and hosted at Special Operations Command Europe. In 2019, we hosted a contested narratives war game in Riga with our Baltic Sea allies and partners, and where this war game in particular explored the formation, projection, and reception of strategic narratives aimed at building resilience against malign influence. And over the course of the game, select participants shared presented narratives, i.e. pre-scripted stories, to amplify or dampen adversary and friendly narratives. Participants then moved between tables, developing constructed narratives, revised scripts, amidst the various contested narratives that were at play in the room. And to do this, we used a World Cafe method, where a professionally and nationally diverse group of participants took turns sharing stories of national resilience against malign influence, wherein the pre-scripted presented narratives contest for resonance within that space. And then after the World Cafe sessions, we convened the national teams to participate in narrative script writing. And we then in those spaces, led by wargame facilitators, the national teams wrote scripts relating to the themes discussed in the earlier session. And this format then offers the opportunities for participants to adjudicate the contestation of narratives that occurred within the World Cafe by communicating which narratives mattered to them and assess their resonance. For example, many of the participants drew on stories and symbols of epic heroes and historic battle flags circulating in the World Cafe as elements of their constructed narrative scripts. So in this manner, the resolution of the war game appeared in the emergent properties of the constructed narratives and through the interaction and at the discretion of the participants. So what these studies and that war game reveal is that wargaming here is truly a participatory narrative experience, as Perla and McGrady note. And analysis of gameplay and the embedded narrative transformation requires frameworks for capturing presented narratives and constructed narratives, and the transformation that occurs between them. And as displayed in the second study, where 3 separate yet simultaneous games reveal similar patterns, these patterns of the structures and patterns in the constructed narrative begin to impact the strategic choices of the players. And so, for example, in our studies, again, those narrative structures impacted the players' choices, and limited whether they were coherent or incoherent in their strategic logic. This then becomes the challenge for us in this evening's ideation session, and that is to say, what serious game design mechanisms enable a research question that asks, what scenarios result in strategic choices of conflict or cooperation? Now let me talk about how we're going to go through these ideation sessions and then give you some things to think about before we step off. So there are a number of ways. Since this is a workshop, this is a learning point for us to participate in. There are a number of ways for which we can get after ideation to come up with different ideas. We can, as we present here, these are just 3 ideas that we can use, and we're going to try to use them here tonight. And that is, we can brainstorm. We're going to spend 10 minutes to discover 2 to 3 best possible ideas on what are the mechanisms we might use to explore the strategic choices in the Arctic. And then we'll also try the worst ideas. That is, we're going to try the 8 worst ideas in 8 minutes, and find out what ideas would be, what game mechanics would be terrible for trying to understand how these scenarios impact strategic choices of conflict or cooperation. But in addition to that, either during this the session or to carry on the conversation afterward, we invite you to also crowdstorm some ideas, and we saw little hints of that when Sebastian shared the notice of this event, where people were starting to share ideas about, hey, does this particular game sounds like something that they might be interested in. And so if you do come up with ideas after tonight's session or during tonight's session, we invite you to post on Twitter using the hashtag GooseArctic to help us capture ideas moving forward that might not have come up in tonight. We didn't capture it. We didn't have a chance to capture it. So feel free to use that space to share some additional ideas. Before we break out, Sebastian, I'd like everyone to keep a few things in mind, a few of the game dynamics in mind. Our presented narratives, the scenarios, if you will begin with the models under development by the Mason team, which includes shipping routes, shipping lanes, port expansion, predicting ice melt, and then also what's the impact of that ice melt on the shoreline, among others. There's numerous other models being developed, but these are the models that come to mind. So I'd ask that when you think about that, you think about, for example, if increased shipping lanes become available, do new places for fishing open, do new places for mineral extraction open, do new parties participate in the shipping lane? So there's becomes increased activities, and what choices then would percolate up?
So John, can I
yes.
give an example?
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
right now, we've had some reports that the predominance of the ships that are cruising along the Russian shoreline for the Russian route are Chinese. And they're bringing bacteria with them that is, let's say, attached to the ships into these pristine waters. And nobody has any idea what this is going to do to aqua farming, for instance. And some of these increased shipping, some of the routes are already objects of conflict, for instance, between the US and Canada, around how we're going to navigate, who's who's got where the end of the territorial waters is, and who has rights to that, and who's going to give over rights for a shipping route up the Canadian side of the Arctic. So what's going to happen to the fisheries? We've already seen some tensions between nations and in the context of the fish farms. So and then we've got all kinds of conflicts, for instance, around rare earth materials and oil that's underneath the Arctic Ocean, and it's going to become accessible. So we've got all kinds of interesting dynamics there to keep in mind.
So absolutely. So in addition to these models that the team is developing, what we'd also like you to consider is player interactions within the game, where there are local indigenous communities interacting with the state. Obviously, there's a number of multiple state and state interactions. And then there's also local to local, so local indigenous communities to other local indigenous communities. And so when you think of the game mechanics, think of these models, these type of models, and think of the player dynamics as well. So quickly, I'll review what we're going to do next. I'll let Sebastian have the con in a second. And what Sebastian's going to do is break us out into 3 groups. Sarah, Dave, Christine, and I will facilitate 10 minutes of conversation, first on brainstorming the best ideas, and we're going to try to get 2 to 3 best ideas together. But we'd ask that you share with us why is that a good idea. So here's an example. And then we'll come back together after that 10 minutes. Sebastian, I'll let you be the master, bring us all back to this larger group where the facilitators will then share what they heard in the brainstorming session. And then when we're done with that, we'll break out again and we'll talk about the 8 worst ideas that we could come up with. We're not going to be as particular, but we're just going to try to spend about 1 minute, if we could, on each of the bad ideas. Again, let's describe why is it bad, and then we'll come back to the larger group and we'll again reflect on what we heard in those ideation sessions, and then wrap up. And I hope we continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Goose Arctic. Before Sarah reminds me that I might have forgotten, we would also invite the folks who'd want to participate and either as play testing or advisors to us as we define this serious game. Please feel free to reach out to us so that you can join us on this particular team. So Sebastian, if that was as clear as mud, sir, could you break us out into our 3 groups? Absolutely.
So we have a couple questions that Sarah sort of addressed, but I would like you guys sort of talk it over the audio. The first one is, how do you weight the different strengths of the key parties and their capability economically, environmentally, and force projection to sort through the ranking of potential conflict? For example, US and Russia and China can have massive impact and many of these factors if they choose.
So I think the answer is we're reflecting back on the narrative structure. So, and in fact, the US provides a very nice example of that challenge. And that is to say, is there probably is half a dozen or more Arctic strategies circulating, published Arctic strategies circulating in the US government, while a smaller state or even the indigenous people might only publish 1, or their Arctic policies or strategies are embedded in a larger policy or strategy. But so it's not founded on the principles of material capability in and of itself. it is an assessment of the military capability, and that assessment of the military capabilities that you talk about, China, Russia, and the US, for example, is found in their propositions of perception. Okay, so we convert then these material capability assessments into an information variable, if you will. We're using the term, we narrativized strategic choice, which originally strategic choice as a theory was based on material assessments of material capabilities and intentions. But to sort of standardize the variables of inputted, we turn the material capability into the assessments of material capability into an information function that we can balance across the board. But we also have to be very cognizant, as I said, that, hey, the US will publish, 6 or more strategies about the Arctic just because of the nature of the actor that it is.
But I actually also responded to that and thought it'd be so cool, because I thought that was a great question. So basically we're addressing it in terms of, looking at the number of policy documents that are a given nation will put out, right? And the assumption is that the more powerful the nation, the more number of policy documents would be, which may be an issue, right? But I think it'd be also way cool to begin to do a relational analysis. So we could ask the players, in the interviews, how they would rank order these parties, right? In terms of just those dimensions you came up with. And it'd be really interesting to see what everybody else thinks would be the rank ordering of this. And it might be exactly as you've said it. Maybe it's a very dominant narrative and everybody would think of it that way. Maybe not. It'd be fun to find out. And then allow them to give weight, allow let's say the interviewees, the stakeholders, to give weight to these various strategies as to what they think are most important and most critical. So great idea.
So I will ask one last question to Sarah, and it was there a potential influence to the participants' lack of awareness in their attempt to reduce conflict actually escalated conflict, like a lack of cross-cultural competency or something along those lines?
No, what's interesting about narrative is that it is cross-cultural. And there are some core principles that are ubiquitous across cultures. Now, they might be performed differently so for instance, Asian cultures, and the way in which those same principles and dynamics are performed in the United States, but they are nonetheless there. And one of the critical ones is delegitimization. So when people from around the world, anywhere, delegitimize somebody else, they know exactly they've been delegitimized. They get it. And it kicks off an effort to reposition themselves positively. And people just do just about anything to do that. And this group that was negatively positioned by the United States players in this paper that you and I did, tried to reposition themselves with the US. They told, no, you don't understand, blah, 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 in an effort to reformulate the relationship that the United States was engaged with them in. And rather than legitimizing them and then partnering with them, they delegitimized them. It destroyed the group itself and ended up in a military coup, escalating conflict. So I think what's interesting about narrative is that it does have very predictable patterns that if we could, circulate that knowledge and we could use it to test things out. We could use it not only to test players' competencies, but we could use it to see what happens in a given scenario when, for instance, a group is delegitimized. How does that work? And the reverse, when they're legitimized, how does that work? So I think, I'm excited to see what the frontier, the sort of the narrative frontier of wargaming would be. Thank you.
All right, so that's all for the questions. I'll stop the recording for now.
In our group, and then Sarah, I pass it to you, and then on to Dave and Christine. So we had 3 ideas for our brainstorming session, which is the first one. Sarah offered a time-phased approach, and the example she gave was the game of the Battle of Moscow, where as you progressed along the game, the terrain changed. There was what she called a mud turn, where the rain and the mud of the battlefield slowed down the player's progress. And so what she envisioned for one of the mechanics in this time-phased approach is that the scenarios change along, for example, you have 3 different scenarios based on 3 changed alternative futures of the Arctic, and that then forces different choices on the participants. And Stephen, and if I screw this up, Stephen, please let me know. I have a little bit more reading to do. Offered inductive adjudication as a mechanism, because what he was offering was that where we have little data, or we don't have a lot of experience in the exploration of this particular game type, we will be challenged to deductively adjudicate the rules of the game. And we want to also avoid red and blue adjudicating the outcomes. And so what we would offer is a third party adjudicating how that conflict might play out throughout the game. So I'm going to go back and pull out Stephen's paper on adjudication and explore that even further. And then finally, Kathleen offered, I think, Kathleen, you said that you guys just recently did an exploration of Arctic challenges, and they used the World Cafe method in their process as a process of discovery. And what she found beneficial of that particular mechanism was the ability to include local leaders in that conversation, moving along. So the 3 that we came up with in our session was using a time-phased approach, using inductive adjudication, and using the World Cafe to help us explore these models. So Sarah, can I pass the mic over to you?
Sure, if I can get my cursor back on my right screen. Well, my group was not tidy. They were very disobedient and refused to do 3 different ones, but we elaborated one that had many, many dimensions, and it ended up being really great. And they named it diplomacy chits. And the idea was to allow the players to have their capabilities designated in terms of economic, multiple dimensions of, warfare capability and some others of those. You'd basically be able to buy chits, essentially, which would reflect your capabilities in these particular areas. If I'm getting this wrong, guys, you just gotta pipe up, right? And you'd create then each group or each player would have a set of victory conditions. And these would be the conditions that they would designate as essentially, constituting victory or something, good outcome, right? But they, of course, could evolve in the course of the game, these victory conditions. So things could happen and people could change, the victory conditions in response to, what's going on in the game. Changes over time. And then you look and see what the deals are that get cut. And there was a lot of, there's recognition that there's going to be, the Arctic Council is going to be a place where some of these conversations will take place, but there's going to be a lot of conversations outside of the Arctic Council about deals that people are going to make and conversations they're going to have with each other. So we thought this notion of diplomacy chits was interesting. And the idea would be to set it up, these victory conditions, so you have win, 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 win possibilities, right? That everybody could win. There wouldn't be a win-lose. You could take events like a search and rescue operation where maybe the Russians are the only ones that could actually affect a search and rescue under certain conditions, and put that in the game as an event, and then watch victory conditions, etc., evolve. Let's see, there was talk of putting different countries in different rooms, and then having them negotiate internal to themselves about what should happen and under what conditions. And then there was a real big interest across the entire group of us that were talking, and having players asking players who they wanted to play in the game, and then making sure they were not assigned that role, so that they would be forced to take on the roles of other people's. And basically the why of all this seemed to be, there were two whys. One, why this seemed to be a good idea is, one is what came up before we broke, players are differentially endowed, right? In the sense with capabilities and with possibilities. So how to make the game represent that is one reason. And the second important logic about why we like this design had to do with particularly the players being not able to play their own side, was that would support learning, right? So this would be a design that would enable, it would also have evolution, because the victory conditions could evolve, right? And Jim is saying something. Jim, why don't you just pipe in and say it? Oh, he can't talk, bless his heart. Yeah, he says in the chat, making sure that players from the US weren't on the US team and Canadians weren't on the Canadian team, forcing players to play different people. And then there's some jokes in the chat about chits. So let me know if I got that right, folks. Yeah, there was jokes about changing the C to an S.
Spot on, Sarah.
Yeah, great.
So Dave and Christine, over to you. Reflections. Who wanted to present there, Dave or Christine?
I'm happy to start, Christine, unless you'd like to. Okay, so we had a couple of different ideas. I don't know if we settled on 3 key ideas, but we do have a couple of different things that I do want to bring up. And I will say to the group members, I'm typing and sort of diagnosing at the speed of conversation. So if I miss anything you said, please do feel free to unmute yourself and speak up here. But one of the first things that was mentioned was thinking about the choice of forums. So what forum you're using to present your ideas internationally. These are the actors within the war game. And the idea here was that actors may create different forums to present their narrative to achieve different goals. So that should be something, at least that is factored into or considered during a war game design. Another group member has extensive experience with this, and his challenge mentions, one of the biggest dynamics for them is figuring out the reaction of each community member when they're trying to put war games together. So it's really tough to focus on the right mechanisms to come up with a strategy. And again, if that group member would like to speak up, happy to have you add there. I know we're short on time. We had a third idea. It was really sort of back to basics, sort of how best to define the Arctic and what does Arctic mean. So these terms can be at odds depending on which nation you're representing. The mechanism here was really thinking about how to implement a wild card factor in the wargaming. One of the big challenges there was, or one of the biggest problems, is that the people who may be affected by Arctic changes may have no say in it. And this member was mainly thinking about Indigenous peoples. And then I guess we had a fourth idea, actually. And this idea was actually seconded by another group member. It was really thinking about, sort of, again, a little bit back to basics, but the best way to represent geography. It may not just be, clearly defined geography boundaries. It may be something more abstract, and trying to figure out how to map that. And again, for this group, geography really may be far less relevant in this type of war game setting. It really should be more about interaction between the internal actors involved throughout those nations. So again, please feel free to correct me where I missed anything, but I think those were our 4 main ideas.
Christine, can you elaborate on anything? Would you like to elaborate on anything there?
No, well summarized. The last point, we kind of got cut off discussing group members' contributions, but yeah, just kind of thinking what are the game board design aspects that would get us, to the goal of the game. And the tendency or the impulse is to just, do a realistic geographical rendering, but thinking through some of the limitations or challenges of that.
Nice.
Great suggestions here, and I look forward to carrying on this conversation even further. Sebastian, so I recall that the next step we're going to, when we go to our breakout rooms, we're going to discuss the worst ideas possible for game mechanisms that help us describe strategic choices of conflict or cooperation. And here again, we're trying to, if we can answer why is that mechanism bad. We don't have to be as thorough. I know that we can do 8 and 8, or we can continue to use this approach that we just had, where we tried to get as many out as we could. But the focus here again is what are the worst possible ideas, and why are they bad? And so Sebastian, you've got the concert.
Go ahead.
So let's follow the same format in reflection if we can. I'll go through my team was very productive. We hit our goals, so kudos to them. We got 8 worst possible ideas. So let's go through them from team 3's perspective. We had a concern that we don't want to add a large groups in conversation where there are more than 8 people in a particular group. It seems to be that 8 people tend to dominate the actual conversation. So how to avoid that dynamic? There was one particular point was to assume that people, the worst idea was that we are assuming that people will read the prepared materials ahead of time before joining the game. I think I saw a chat that wargame preparation begins when you close the door of your car in the parking lot. The experience is that nobody's doing their homework. There's another idea that mechanisms that delay communication, which is interesting. I'm interested in this one only because an example given is that of translation, and in an environment like the Art Council, I think we would. So how do we handle this delay in communication, and how that influences the game would be an interesting aspect to explore. How to break a game was offered, and we offered 2 variations on how to break a game. Is where if you sense a gender imbalance in a game, you can break the game if you try to spread out, say for example, women into multiple rooms to make sure that there's a balanced representation across the room. That the concern was in some social situations, women might be less vocal, they haven't obviously shared a room with Sarah Cobb, but that people might be concerned about not sharing. And I provided an inverse example where there were too many Americans in our contested narrative war game, where we were trying to seek the perspective of our allies and partners, and too many Americans started flooding the room with their conversation. Let's see. One thing actually was a good idea. I guess the worst possible idea was not to have a mechanism or a referee for the adjudication. Because if the adjudicators can't agree, you'll stall progress in the game. So not having a referee or a mechanism to referee adjudication is a bad idea. Also a bad idea on the adjudication side of the house is packing the adjudication team with experts from across the span of things that you need, because you'll become stymied by all of these experts and the interconnectedness between all of the issues. And then one final worst possible idea was having a very senior officer, a very senior figure in the room, because that dominates the room, and then what happens is people become deferential to that person, and they lose the sort of interaction between the groups. Sarah, over to you.
Well, my group had 12 bad ideas. So, and there were really great bad ideas. First, make sure first, don't prepare for the last war. Don't organize for Third World War or to replicate the Second World War, something like that. That was one. Two, do not fail to engage the indigenous. They must be included in everything. 3, the Arctic is likely to de-ice in ways that is non-predictable relative to our efforts to predict it. So even though we have models of when the ice is going to melt and it's going to melt, it's not going to go like that. So we should not get wedded to the climate models that we have and how the Arctic is going to behave. 4th, we cannot presume that the Arctic is a region unto itself, right? Even though it is a region, it has, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So it's got to be, it's got to have global dynamics and global perspectives involved. All of this was great. There was some reference to the mud effect in the Second World War, but the mud effect in the Arctic is going to be legendary, right? Because you're talking about melting permafrost. So some of these kind of things we've got to include those. 6th, we have to be ready to understand that time is different. And I think time and space is different. And so this was related to a comment that getting stuff to the Arctic is, very, very difficult and time consuming, takes a long time. And that the time-space dimension must be taken into consideration. If I'm butchering this, folks, you got to speak up. Another, let's see, that was 7, it would be a mistake to separate out dimensions of conflict, the dimensions from each other. So for instance, you wouldn't want to just focus on economic conflict or security issues. You have to try to do something in an integrated way. The next one is going to be, there's some kind of, this again probably is related to the models not working, the climate models, that there's likely to be some kind of incompleteness of our knowledge about what's going on up there. That's how I framed this thing. There are factors around fisheries, things like that. We don't even know what all the fish are up there. So we've got some holes in our knowledge that we got to pay attention to. Another one that was number 8. Number 9 is you got some technical problems. And these are like, my folks were thinking about GPS is not working and technical stuff because it's the Arctic, not working the way you think. And so it breaks down communication and things like that. So you can't assume that those things would be working in the same way they do in other locations. Another one I thought was great was don't assume that that's just because you're allies, the players might be allies or that allies in other dimensions, that you know what they want, need, or that you're going to be allies in the Arctic. So there's a way in which you can't take for granted the diplomatic relations, shouldn't be taken for granted. Let's see, there should not be, another one was you'd have to set this up so you don't have clear red-blue teams, because that would create a binary set of phenomena that wouldn't work here. Let's see, unclose. You'd have to pay attention and not leave out unclose and the law of the sea, but not necessarily rely on it because it's not going to solve your problems. It'd be a bad idea to design the game to presupposed aggression, right? That was, I think, the last one. You can't presuppose or presume that there's going to be aggression. So anything else, guys? Did I unmute yourself if I missed something? Okay, I think they're satisfied.
Thanks, Sarah. Dave and Christine.
Sure. And Christine, again, I'm happy to go first if you'd like.
That's great, Dave. Yep.
Yes, same to my group as well. If I miss anything, please do speak up. I never know how bad my typing is until 90% of my page has red underlines in it. So I'm sure I've missed things here and there. So one of the things that our group began with was picking from our previous conversation, thinking about geography. And so one of our framing comments was that, especially with geography, we really don't know the shape of the future enough to make overarching assumptions within wargames. So I think this has a lot of overlaps with what John and Sarah were speaking about within their groups. Someone mentioned Sarah's example of the Chinese shipping that had bacteria on the bottom of the boat and was going through the lanes. So again, there's just so much out there that could happen. It's just so hard to make assumptions. In terms of player roles, some folks suggested that you need to step out of the role. If people are representing themselves, whether it's US, Canada, or the UK, they may take things personally. And then we had two views on this comment. One view is that the game may have limited value if they can't be played by a random participant, but for Indigenous communities, it could be a mistake to play them as actors, that it might be better to play them as a fixed set of interests to be defended or represented. The thought here was that the interests may not change dramatically, so to play them as if they were the Canadian government or something, or a nation, could be a mistake. So there was an opposing view here as well, that the Native community can have huge effect on domestic politics of nations. So they do have their own identity. Our governments do recognize that they are a community, and it's hard to consider them as not having a voice in a war game setting. Let me scroll down a little bit, sorry. Okay, so for our bad ideas, we had combining Arctic and Antarctic efforts, especially if we're only talking about harsh environments or climate change. The next point, and this was more of a challenge, but one member was thinking about how do you monitor activities or prove that folks are violating sea lanes and have verifiable information, who has credibility. Again, very tough to prove since it's about big ocean visibility when looking at shipping lines or escorts. Another bad idea was totally removing or discounting military aspects. Some factions are definitely more focused on security than others. The competition aspect of security should not be discounted in the Arctic, and some will use securitization to enable or defend against motives. Our sixth bad idea would be having standard winning conditions. So the idea here was that we really need to have different concepts of what winning or losing looks like. And there were two subpoints here. So really to let groups or teams have their own objectives. And then that helps you to see the friction points. And then you can let those groups evaluate themselves. So you have an AAR, an after action report from specific groups. So the bad idea here was really taking current state of economics, relating that forward. We don't know, and again, I invite that group member to speak up here, but that we don't know that claimants are firm, especially for rare earth elements. Who owns those in the future are unknowns. Another bad idea is to assume that all actors are national actors. Again, this is sort of back to our Indigenous comment, that multinational organization actions may spark a conflict. And I was cut and pasting the last bad idea when we were yanked out by the digital hook. But it was something about not giving gaming space to the game so that the things you might never thought of can be played.
Nice. That's a good idea.
And again, please do let me know if I missed anything.
My notes are full of bad ideas and good ideas. I can't wait to compare this with Dave, Christine, and Sarah at one of our future team meetings. Everyone, thank you very much for all of these ideas. They're going to be very helpful as we step forward in designing this. Again, I'd like to offer an invitation if you want to continue the conversation with us on the design of this game. Maybe you want to potentially play test prototypes that we come up with, or you just want to be a friendly voice or an ear to our concerns and our questions, feel free to reach out to Sarah and I on email. My George Mason email is jdrosa@gmu.edu. That's George Mason University. I'm also on Twitter at JP DeRosa. You can connect and DM me there. Sarah, did you want to share your information that people can connect with you?
Sorry, I'm putting it in the chat to everybody.
Sebastian, I don't know about you. Other than my utter failure in I thought this was a very useful workshop. I learned a lot in the conversations. I learned from all of you here, so I appreciate that. I hope all of you learned something about ideation and possible ways to ideate. If nothing else, if this was bad, you learned how not to do it. Right? There's always a way to learn in that regard. Sebastian, sir, you have the con. I'll pass the baton back to you.
First of all, I would like to thank all of you for leading our first workshop. I think went splendidly, and I think I only see positive comments in the chat. So I want to thank all of you and your team. And you're always welcome back to join us again at another webinar at Goose. And I want to thank our participants for the great ideas and also their bad ideas during this workshop. And I hope we'll see you next week for our next webinar.